He never chose power. It was waiting for him before he understood what choice meant. His last name carried weight long before his voice did. Doors opened without introduction. Mistakes were softened. Silence followed his presence instinctively. From the outside, people called it privilege. From the inside, it felt like inevitability. He was raised inside an empire that didn't announce itself as one. There were no speeches about legacy, no emotional declarations, only expectations. Quiet, constant, unquestionable. He learned early that his life did not belong entirely to him. Decisions were framed as opportunities. Paths were presented as obvious. Alternatives were never discussed, not because they were forbidden, but because they were unthinkable. His childhood was structured, protected, optimized. Every school chosen carefully, every friendship evaluated subtly, every interest encouraged or discouraged with precision. Nothing was random, and nothing was free. He understood very young that affection was conditional, not cruelly, systematically. Approval followed alignment. Distance followed deviation. He learned to read rooms before speaking, to adjust his tone, to sense when silence was preferable to honesty. This skill was praised. They called him mature, disciplined, prepared. They didn't call him obedient. At family gatherings, conversations revolved around continuity, growth, reputation. No one asked what he wanted. They asked what he planned. And planning, in that family, meant preservation. The empire wasn't just financial, it was psychological. It shaped posture, language, emotion. Weakness wasn't punished, it was ignored. And being ignored was worse. He watched his father closely, a man who never raised his voice, never rushed, never explained. Authority flowed from him naturally, not because he demanded it, but because everyone had learned to anticipate it. That was the model: power without noise, control without force. He absorbed it unconsciously. By adolescence, he had already learned to split himself. There was the version of him that performed, and the version that felt. The second learned to stay quiet. He excelled academically, socially, publicly. Inside, he felt hollow in ways he couldn't describe. He didn't rebel. Rebellion would have been noticed. He complied. Compliance earned him space, access, protection. It also erased friction. And friction, he would later understand, is how identity forms. As he grew older, the future narrowed. There was never a single moment where he chose to inherit the empire. The choice was spread across years of small acceptances. Each yes felt insignificant. Together, they became irreversible. He entered the business not out of passion, but out of gravity. Everyone expected it. And expectation, when unanimous, feels like destiny. He told himself he would change things from the inside, bring humanity, modernize. That belief sustained him for a while, until he realized something unsettling. The system did not need his belief. It only needed his presence. He was not being prepared to lead. He was being prepared to maintain. And maintenance does not tolerate deviation. That understanding arrived slowly, but once it did, he could not unsee it. The transition into the empire was presented as natural. There was no ceremony, no initiation, just a desk waiting for him. The building carried the same quiet authority as his childhood home: neutral colors, controlled light. Voices kept deliberately low. Everyone knew who he was. No one asked who he wanted to become. His role was explained carefully, as if clarity could soften inevitability. Responsibilities were framed as trust, oversight as mentorship. He listened. He learned. He noticed how people adjusted themselves around him, how opinions softened, how disagreements dissolved before forming. At first, he mistook this for respect. Later, he understood it was caution. He was not expected to lead boldly. He was expected to embody continuity, to say the right things, to preserve relationships, to never surprise anyone. He learned quickly that decisions were rarely about outcomes. They were about alignment, what preserved the image, what maintained stability, what avoided disruption. And disruption, he discovered, was the true enemy. He began to feel the weight of inherited expectations in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every mistake felt amplified, every hesitation scrutinized. He wasn't allowed to fail publicly, but he also wasn't allowed to succeed independently. Praise came carefully, always collective, never personal. He started to sense the invisible boundaries, where initiative ended, where obedience began. He watched older executives closely, men who had been there for decades. They spoke with authority, but never outside the script. They knew when to stop talking, when to defer, when to wait. He realized they were not powerful in the way outsiders imagined. They were reliable, and reliability in this system mattered more than brilliance. Slowly, his inner voice grew quieter, not because he lost opinions, but because expressing them felt pointless. Every idea was filtered through tradition, every innovation diluted by consensus. He told himself this was patience, that change required time. But time, he noticed, never arrived. He began to feel like an actor performing a role written long before him, his days filled with meetings that looked productive, but changed nothing. Decisions that felt important, but preserved the same structure. He was busy, respected, and increasingly absent from himself. Outside the office, people treated him differently now. Friends deferred, strangers admired, potential partners approached cautiously. He noticed how quickly people projected assumptions onto him. He felt seen and unseen at the same time. No one asked him what he believed. They asked what he represented. That distinction unsettled him. He tried, quietly, to create small spaces of autonomy, minor decisions, subtle shifts in tone. Each attempt was met with polite resistance, not rejection, correction. He was reminded, gently, of how things worked, of the importance of unity, of how deviation could be misunderstood. Misunderstood. The word carried more weight than any threat. He learned that misunderstanding in this world meant risk, reputational, relational, structural. And so he adjusted again. He told himself that leadership required restraint, that maturity meant sacrificing ego. But deep down, something felt wrong. He wasn't sacrificing ego, he was sacrificing self. And the more he did, the harder it became to remember what that self had wanted in the first place. Loneliness arrived quietly, not as isolation, but as distance. He was surrounded by people every day, yet no one ever asked how he was holding up. They assumed strength, stability, gratitude. After all, what reason could he possibly have to feel lost? This assumption trapped him, because admitting discomfort felt obscene, ungrateful, weak. He learned quickly that his struggles were invisible by design. When he spoke about pressure, people nodded politely. When he hinted at doubt, they redirected the conversation. "You're lucky. You have everything. You'll understand with time." These phrases ended discussions before they could begin. He began to feel guilty for wanting something different. Not guilty toward the empire, but toward the idea of privilege itself. How could he want freedom when he had been given security? How could he want anonymity when his name carried protection? This guilt became a constant undercurrent. He stopped expressing dissatisfaction, stopped questioning the path. Instead, he questioned himself. Maybe this was adulthood. Maybe everyone felt this way. Maybe fulfillment was overrated. He tried to convince himself that meaning would come later, after the next milestone, after the next promotion, after he proved himself worthy of the legacy. But milestones came and went, and nothing changed. The work expanded, but the boundaries tightened. The expectations grew, but the autonomy shrank. He noticed how carefully his behavior was observed, not watched. Maintenant sectatemaz. Charest, how he spoke, who he met, what he posted, everything reflected back on the family. His individuality was no longer private. It was a liability. He began censoring himself instinctively, not only in public, but internally. He avoided thoughts that felt dangerous, ideas that suggested alternatives, because alternatives implied choice, and choice implied responsibility. Responsibility for disappointing people who had invested in him long before he could consent. This realization created a crack, a subtle one. He began to imagine different lives, not grand escapes, just quieter versions of existence. A life where his name meant nothing, where mistakes were allowed, where effort didn't need justification. These thoughts brought relief and immediate shame. He felt disloyal for even imagining them. The empire had given him everything: protection, purpose, status. How dare he question it? That internal conflict began to wear him down. He slept poorly, felt restless during the day, irritable without knowing why. He noticed how quickly he became defensive when questioned, how easily he defaulted to control. Power had begun to shape him from the inside, not as confidence, but as rigidity. He saw glimpses of himself in his father now, the same restraint, the same emotional economy, the same distance, and that terrified him, because he realized this wasn't a role he was playing. It was a transformation underway, slow, silent, irreversible if left unchecked. He was becoming someone who could function perfectly while feeling nothing. And that was the first moment he understood. The empire didn't just demand loyalty, it demanded his interior life. He didn't rebel openly. Rebellion would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have exposed how little space he actually had. Instead, he searched for air in quieter places, outside the empire. He began spending time with people who knew nothing about his last name. people who didn't lower their voices when he spoke, who disagreed casually, who didn't look at him as a continuation of something larger. With them, he felt lighter, not powerful, human. These relationships weren't dramatic. They didn't promise escape. They offered contrast. And contrast was dangerous. He noticed how relaxed he felt when no one expected him to represent anything, how easily he laughed, how his body loosened. That frightened him because it revealed how tense he had been for years. He tried to keep these connections separate, unobserved, unremarkable, but nothing stayed unnoticed for long. The empire didn't spy. It sensed. Schedules shifted. Questions appeared. Casual remarks from executives. A raised eyebrow from a family member. A reminder, disguised as concern, about priorities. He understood the message immediately. Independence registered as risk. He was careful. He framed his absences as networking, his interests as strategy, his relationships as image building. He learned to translate desire into acceptable language. Still, something changed. He was no longer fully compliant. And systems built on continuity noticed that quickly. The pressure didn't come as force. It came as responsibility. He was entrusted with more visibility, more meetings, more symbolic roles. The empire didn't punish deviation, it absorbed it, by pulling him closer, by tightening the circle. His world shrank again, this time faster. The contrast he had tasted made returning unbearable. The empire felt heavier now, more artificial, less negotiable. He began to feel trapped in a way he hadn't before, not because the walls had moved, but because he had. He saw how every attempt at autonomy triggered correction, how every personal choice became a discussion. He wasn't asked to stop. He was reminded to align. Alignment, he realized, was the empire's true language, and alignment required surrender. He felt the internal conflict sharpen. Staying meant disappearing slowly. Leaving meant detonating everything he had been built to protect. There was no clean exit for someone like him, only rupture. And rupture carried consequences he had been trained to fear since childhood. He began to understand that the empire didn't need his belief anymore. It needed his silence. And silence, this time, felt unbearable. The pressure didn't arrive through commands. It arrived through memory. Stories resurfaced at family gatherings, carefully chosen anecdotes about sacrifice, about ancestors who had endured far worse so the empire could exist. These stories were never directed at him explicitly. They didn't need to be. They were reminders. You are part of something bigger. You owe more than you realize. Your discomfort is insignificant compared to what was given to you. Guilt became the language of continuity. His father never accused him of anything. That would have been crude. Instead, he spoke of responsibility, of stewardship, of how fragile trust could be. Trust, he explained, was earned over generations and lost in a moment. The message was clear. One wrong move wouldn't just affect him. It would ripple outward. He felt the weight of that implication settle heavily on his chest. The empire didn't threaten him with loss. It threatened him with consequence. The possibility of being remembered as the weak link. He noticed how his relatives spoke about others who had drifted away. Distant cousins, former partners. names mentioned briefly, without detail. People who had chosen something else, their stories were never explained. They were simply absent. Absence, he understood, was the family's final verdict. He began to feel watched in a different way now, not monitored, measured against expectation. Every decision carried a shadow. He started second-guessing even private thoughts, questioning whether his discomfort was real or merely a failure of discipline. He told himself that desire was childish, that sacrifice was maturity, but the body resisted. He felt restless, on edge, unable to settle. His temper shortened, his patience thinned. He caught himself snapping at people who didn't deserve it, mirroring the very rigidity he despised. That frightened him more than anything else, because it meant the empire was winning, not through force, through transformation. He was becoming what it required. The conflict finally surfaced one evening when his father asked a simple question, not about business, not about plans, about loyalty. He asked whether his son understood what the family represented, what it meant to be entrusted with continuity. The question wasn't rhetorical. It demanded an answer. For the first time, he didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched. His father waited. That waiting carried more authority than any order. He realized that silence, here, was already a form of defiance. He answered carefully. He said he understood the responsibility. But responsibility, he added, should not require self-erasure. The word surprised even him. The room grew still. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No raised voices. But something fundamental shifted. The empire had been named, not as opportunity, but as cost, and once named, it could no longer pretend to be benevolent. From that moment on, the conflict was no longer internal. It had entered the open, and there would be no return to quiet compliance. The reaction was not immediate. That was the first lesson. The empire did not respond emotionally. It recalibrated. After that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. Schedules remained full. Meetings proceeded as planned. Courtesy stayed intact. But something essential shifted. Information stopped flowing naturally. Updates arrived later. Decisions were presented as fate's accomplice. He wasn't excluded, he was repositioned. His presence became ceremonial, symbolic. He was still visible, but no longer central. This kind of marginalization was subtle enough to deny, and effective enough to wound. He felt it in meetings where his input was acknowledged politely, then ignored. In conversations where people spoke around him, not to him. The empire didn't confront his words. It neutralized them. Isolation followed quietly. Not social isolation, structural isolation. He was removed from processes where influence actually happened, left with roles that looked important from the outside. Public continuity, private distance. He realized then that power in the empire was not held by position, but by proximity to decision, and that proximity was being withdrawn. No one explained why. Explanation would imply negotiation. This was correction. He felt a familiar impulse rise, to apologize, to clarify, to reassure. He resisted it. That resistance came at a cost. He became the subject of concern. Relatives spoke gently now, asking if he was overwhelmed. Executives framed his distance as stress. The narrative formed without him. He was no longer the future leader questioning structure. He was the sensitive heir struggling to adapt. This framing was devastating because it was believable. and impossible to fight without confirming it. He understood then how power preserves itself, not by crushing dissent, but by redefining it. He felt anger for the first time. Not explosive, focused anger at the elegance of the system, at how compassion was weaponized, at how easily identity could be rewritten. He also felt fear, not of losing wealth, but of losing authorship of his own life. The realization was brutal. If he stayed, his resistance would be slowly converted into weakness. If he left, his departure would be framed as failure. There was no version where he won publicly, only one where he remained intact privately. That clarity stripped away illusion. He stopped trying to be understood, stopped hoping the empire would soften. He began to prepare, not materially, but psychologically. Preparation meant accepting loss in advance, loss of position, loss of narrative, loss of belonging. These losses no longer felt hypothetical. They felt necessary. The empire had made its move. Now he would have to make his. The final confrontation never took the shape he once imagined. There was no argument, no breaking point marked by raised voices or slammed doors. There was only recognition. He realized that the empire no longer needed to pressure him. It had already decided who he was allowed to be. His role was shrinking into something ceremonial, a name, a presence, a symbol of continuity without agency. The more he resisted internally, the clearer it became. Staying would not preserve anything meaningful. It would only prolong the illusion that he still had a voice. He watched how decisions moved forward without him, how strategies were announced, not discussed, how his agreement was assumed. He understood then that consent had become procedural. He was expected to nod, not to lead. This awareness didn't make him furious. It made him calm. Calm in a way that only comes when choice becomes unavoidable. He stopped attending certain meetings, not dramatically, selectively. He declined invitations that existed purely for optics. He shortened conversations that circled loyalty without substance. No one stopped him. No one followed. That silence confirmed everything. His father noticed last, not because he was inattentive, but because authority rarely expects withdrawal. They spoke again, briefly. There were no accusations, only statements. His father said the family had always valued unity, that fractures weakened trust. He replied that unity without agency was obedience. The word landed heavily, not because it was aggressive, but because it was accurate. His father didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply said that choices come with consequences. This time, the words didn't frighten him. They clarified. Consequences were no longer a threat. They were the price of truth. He realized that leaving wouldn't be framed as courage. It would be framed as instability, as ingratitude, as immaturity, and that narrative would live longer than his explanation ever could. He accepted that, because staying would cost him something far worse. It would cost him coherence. He began to detach in earnest now, not emotionally, structurally. He reviewed his life with a new lens, what belonged to him, what belonged to the empire. The distinction was painful. So much of what he thought was identity was infrastructure. He understood now why so few people ever left. Not because they couldn't survive without wealth, but because they didn't know who they were without it. He felt fear again, not paralyzing, clarifying. Fear of stepping into a life without scripts, without inherited authority. But beneath that fear was something unfamiliar, anticipation, not excitement, possibility. He hadn't made the announcement yet, hadn't formalized anything, but internally the decision had settled. He would leave, not loudly, not vengefully, completely. And that completeness would be the most disruptive act of all. He delayed the announcement longer than he expected, not out of fear, but out of respect for the magnitude of what he was undoing. Leaving the empire wasn't just a professional decision. It was an existential one. Every morning, he rehearsed different versions of himself. The one who stayed and learned to live smaller. The one who left and learned to live unknown. Neither felt comfortable. He noticed how much of his identity had been built around anticipation. People expected things from him before he entered a room, before he spoke. Without that anticipation, who would he be? The thought unsettled him more than loss of wealth ever could. He began to imagine anonymity, not romantic anonymity, practical anonymity. Being wrong without consequence, being ordinary without disappointment. These images felt both liberating and humiliating. He realized how deeply prestige had trained his nervous system, how silence felt louder without it, how stillness felt unsafe. He wasn't addicted to power. He was conditioned by it. That distinction mattered, because conditioning can be unlearned. Slowly, painfully, he noticed how often he still adjusted his posture unconsciously, lowered his voice, waited for deference that never came, and when it didn't, he felt exposed. This exposure wasn't danger, it was unfamiliarity. The empire responded to his continued distance with patience. Patience in this family was never passive. It was strategic. Relatives checked in gently, not to ask questions, to remind him of belonging. He received invitations that felt ceremonial, opportunities that looked generous, offers framed as reconciliation. Each one carried the same implication. You can still come back. He recognized the pattern immediately. Return without autonomy. Presence without authorship. These offers weren't traps. They were exits disguised as entrances. He declined politely. Each refusal made the next conversation shorter. He noticed how quickly warmth cooled into formality, how concern became efficiency. This didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how little it hurt. He had already grieved the belonging. Now he was grieving illusion. That grief was quieter, cleaner. He began to feel something unexpected. Clarity. Without the constant negotiation, his thoughts slowed. He slept better, breathed deeper. For the first time in years, he wasn't preparing for a future someone else had designed. He was sitting inside uncertainty. And uncertainty, though frightening, felt honest. He tried to stay. Not in the empire, in the world it had insulated him from. He took meetings outside the family's orbit, worked on projects where his name carried no currency. The first weeks were brutal. People didn't defer, didn't wait, didn't soften criticism. He wasn't offended. He was destabilized. He realized how rarely he had been challenged directly, how much of his confidence had been borrowed from status. Without it, he felt younger, less certain, more exposed. He made mistakes. No one corrected them gently. They let them stand. This was humiliating and grounding. For the first time, feedback didn't threaten a legacy. It threatened only his ego. An ego, he discovered, could survive far more than he'd been taught. He began to feel something resembling ownership, of failure, of effort, of learning. This progress was invisible to the empire, and that invisibility felt like relief. Still, doubt returned at night. He questioned whether he was romanticizing hardship, whether he would regret walking away from certainty. He imagined future headlines, family gatherings he would no longer attend, conversations that would stop mid-sentence when he entered a room. He wondered if independence was simply another illusion, a story people told themselves to justify discomfort. These thoughts didn't paralyze him. They humbled him. He stopped framing the decision as bravery, or rebellion, or self-actualization. He reframed it as alignment. Staying would require permanent dissonance. Leaving required temporary pain. He chose the pain with an end. That choice didn't make him free, but it made him coherent. He hadn't left yet, not officially, but the life he was moving toward could no longer coexist with the one he was expected to maintain. The overlap was ending. And endings, he was learning, don't announce themselves. They withdraw. The last invitation arrived without ceremony. No urgency. No pressure. Just a meeting request, framed as routine. He understood immediately what it was. Not a negotiation, a confirmation. The empire didn't need him to agree anymore. It needed to know whether he would comply. The room was familiar. Same table, same restrained light. The conversation unfolded with practiced calm. They spoke about continuity, about transition, about how timing mattered. Nothing personal was said, and yet everything was. They offered him a position that looked like authority from the outside, a role with visibility, with prestige, without influence, a place designed to keep his name attached while removing the possibility of disruption. It was generous, elegant, and final. He realized then that this was the empire's preferred ending. No rupture, no scandal, just absorption. He felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to accept, to preserve harmony, to avoid loss. This reflex had protected him his entire life. Now it felt like suffocation. He asked one question, not about power, not about money, about autonomy. Would this role allow him to decide without approval? The answer was diplomatic, carefully phrased, ultimately clear. No, that clarity was a relief. He declined, not dramatically, not defiantly, simply. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't tense. It was resolved. They nodded, thanked him for his honesty, reminded him the door would remain open. He knew what that meant. The door would remain open as long as he agreed to return unchanged. He left the building knowing something irreversible had happened, not externally, internally. He was no longer waiting. Word traveled quickly, without being spoken. Invitations stopped. Calls slowed. His name began appearing less frequently in conversations that once revolved around him. Not erased, archived. He noticed how efficient the disappearance was. No one confronted him. No one criticized him publicly. The empire didn't punish departure. It neutralized it by continuing perfectly without him. That realization stung more than rejection ever could. He had spent years believing he was essential. Now he understood the truth. He was replaceable, by design. The system didn't need exceptional individuals. It needed continuity, and continuity had already been secured. He felt the final layer of attachment dissolve. Not anger, not bitterness, acceptance. He stopped checking for updates, stopped scanning conversations for hints of regret. He let go of the fantasy that his absence would be noticed meaningfully. Instead, he focused on what was real. His days outside the empire were still uncertain, still unpolished, but they belonged to him. He felt awkward in rooms where no one knew his history, where introductions didn't precede him. This awkwardness didn't diminish him. It defined him. For the first time, he was not inherited, not anticipated, not managed. He was present, and presence, he realized, was something the empire had never taught him how to sustain. At night, doubt still visited, but it no longer commanded him. He understood now that the price of inherited power was never paid in money. It was paid in authorship, and he had chosen to reclaim it. He hadn't announced his departure publicly, but the life he was building no longer intersected with the one he left behind. The separation was complete. Only the final step remained. Not departure, naming. He didn't announce his departure. There was no statement, no public explanation, no attempt to reclaim the narrative. He simply stopped arriving, and the world adjusted. That was the final lesson the empire taught him. Systems survive absence effortlessly. At first, the silence felt accusatory, as if it were waiting for him to return, to correct himself, to apologize. Then the silence changed. It became neutral. Rooms filled without him. Decisions moved forward. New names appeared where his once stood. The empire did not collapse. It didn't even pause. And that truth, more than anything, freed him. Because it proved something essential. His worth had never been structural. It had been symbolic. The name had mattered more than the person carrying it. Without that name acting as armor, he felt exposed in unfamiliar ways. People didn't defer, didn't soften criticism, didn't wait for his approval. At first, this felt like loss. Then it felt like honesty. He began to understand how much of his confidence had been inherited, not earned. How much of his calm had been maintained by insulation. Now, every reaction was real, every consequence proportional. He failed publicly for the first time, misjudged people, misread situations, and nothing catastrophic happened. The world didn't punish him, it simply responded. That responsiveness felt grounding. He started to build a life that didn't require permission. Small, imperfect, slow. There were moments of regret. Not for leaving wealth, but for the years spent believing obedience was loyalty. He mourned the version of himself that never had language for refusal. That believed inheritance was destiny. He also mourned the family he would never fully rejoin, not because he wasn't welcome, but because returning would require erasing what he had learned. The door he knew would always be open, but it only opened inward. He chose to stay outside. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was spacious. In that space, he discovered something the empire had never offered him: authorship. He could choose without anticipating consequence beyond himself. He could fail without shaming generations. He could exist without representing anyone but who he was becoming. The power he had inherited was impressive, but the power he reclaimed was quieter and infinitely more fragile. It required responsibility instead of obedience, presence instead of performance, and that fragility made it real. He didn't emerge triumphant, he emerged intact, and that, he understood now, was the rarest inheritance of all.